3, hit it!
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's Caffeine for the Soul. And this is the second part of a little mini-series on what is mental health. And in part one, I talked about how mental health is innate, and I talked about how we can sort of see it in our resilience, in our ability to get over things, to get back to as good as new, in our ability to see the kindness of the design, to see our health at work. And ultimately, in our own sense of inner peace, peace of mind, well-being. What I wanted to talk about in today's podcast is what is it to realize our mental health? What is it to really see it for ourselves? So for myself, my entire life changed in a moment of seeing my mental health. And if you've listened to me at all, I'm sure you know the story, but it's a short story, so I'll tell it. I was watching a video of this Scottish mystic Sid Banks talking about life, and I was half watching it, half drinking a beer, half waiting for a baseball game. It's a lot of halves. And he said every human being is sitting in the middle of mental health. They just don't know it. And I spit the beer out my nose, and I laughed for 10 minutes because somehow, in that moment, I saw that I had utterly convinced myself, been convinced by others, however you want to think about it, but I was utterly convinced that I was broken. And I thought I was doing a great job with my brokenness. I was a high-functioning depressive. It never occurred to me that that wasn't true. It had never occurred to me for some reason until that moment that I was as good as new. I still had original grace that I was born with, that in the same way that as a baby I was born happy, that was still in me. And all that had changed was it had gotten covered over. And in that moment it was uncovered, it was obvious, it was like, oh, it's been there all along. And it was, I think the reason I laughed so much was partly relief from 40 years at that point of trying to get over my mental illness. But also the sheer simplicity that there was nothing I needed to do to be more of who I always was. That in the same way as it would make no sense to try and get a nose if I thought I didn't have a nose, it made no sense to try and get mental health, to become mentally healthy, if I'd been mentally healthy all along. And I was also kind of upset about it, because it seemed to me unfair and horrible and awful that I'd spent so much of my life, 30 years of the 40 at least, trying to overcome, trying to find mental health, trying to overcome mental illness, not seeing that it had been there all along. And a mentor of mine at the time, now a friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Pettit, a psychiatrist who has a long history of working in these principles, this inside-out understanding that I talk about each week. He said to me, if you've been stumbling around in the dark and you've smashed into a lot of things and knocked over some furniture, when the lights come on, you can either give yourself crap about all the things you've knocked over and broken, or you can be really grateful for the light. And that made sense to me. And I decided as best I could, I was just going to be grateful for the fact that I saw it now and not worry too much about all the time that I hadn't seen it. And since that day, since that moment, I've begun to see that health in everybody. It's almost like, it's funny, my wife and I went to a campground We were visiting some friends, and we brought the dogs to have a run on the beach. And there was a guy there, and he had a dog, and he was an older guy, and he was drinking outside of his, I don't know what it was, a Winnebago or something like that. And the first time we walked by with the dog, he was pretty friendly, and he was making jokes about letting his dog attack our dogs, and it was fine. It wasn't actually, that sounds horrible, but it wasn't. It was cute. And then we walked by again later in the day, and he'd obviously been drinking more, and he started swearing at us and cussing us out and calling us all sorts of names for having the temerity to walk by. And he said, "You don't know, my dog is crazy," and it was kind of funny, a little bit like, ugh. But my wife and I were talking about him afterwards. She said, "That was not a nice man." And I said, "You know what? It seems really apparent to me, looking at him, that there are 3 of him in there." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, the top layer was the guy we met the first time. And he was polite. He was well-mannered. He was making appropriate conversation to the moment. And we've all got that top level of our personality." I said, "The second guy, the guy who came out when he was drunk, well, that was the miserable guy who lives in a world where people are like this and things are like this and life is like this and rah, 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 rah." And I said, "The thing is, most people think that's the real them." I said, "But underneath that, there's a sweetheart. Underneath that, there's somebody who knows better. There's somebody who's absolutely okay. There's somebody who is filled with love and life. There's somebody who has innate mental health, but just doesn't know it, who's sitting in the middle of mental health, but just hasn't realized it yet." And so in a way, the search for mental health is the search for our true nature, our deepest nature, our essential nature. And we're going to find it underneath our personality. And we're going to find it underneath our dark side, because it exists before thought. You could call it our spiritual nature. You've probably heard the Teilhard de Chardin quote that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Well, that spiritual beingness, that essential nature of all of us, is mental health. And we have personalities, and we have all sorts of historical thinking that when it's looking very real to us makes us feel very mentally unhealthy. And yet, in any moment, we can fall out of all that thinking, fall out of our personalities, fall out of our drunken personalities, out of our dark side personalities, and fall back into our deeper nature, back into our health, back into who and what we really are. Have fun, learn heaps, and I'll talk with you soon.